Good morning. The Jay Treaty. The Treaty of Amity, Commerce, and Navigation between His Britannic Majesty and the United States of America, commonly known as the Jay Treaty, and also Jay's Treaty, the British Treaty, and the Treaty of London of 1794, was a 1795 treaty between the United States and the Great Britain that is credited with averting war, resolving issues remaining since the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which ended the American Revolution, and facilitating 10 years of peaceful trade between the United States and Britain in the midst of the French Revolutionary Wars, which began in 1792. The terms of the treaty were designed primarily by Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, strongly supported by the chief negotiator John Jay, and supported by President George Washington. The treaty gained the primary American goals, which included the withdrawal of British Army units from pre-revolutionary forts that it had failed to relinquish in the Northwest Territory of the United States, the area west of Pennsylvania and north of the Ohio River. The British had recognized this area as American territory in the Treaty of Paris of 1783. The parties agreed that disputes over wartime debts and the American-Canadian boundary were to be set to arbitration, one of the first major uses of arbitration in diplomatic history. The Americans were granted limited rights to trade with British possessions in India and colonies in the Caribbean in exchange for some limits on the American export of cotton. The treaty was hotly contested by the Jeffersonians in each state. They feared that closer economic ties with Britain would strengthen Hamilton's Federalist Party, promote aristocracy, and undercut republicanism. Washington's announced support proved decisive, and the treaty was ratified by a two-thirds majority of the Senate in November 1794. The treaty became a central issue of contention, leading to the formation of the first party system, with the Federalists favoring Britain and the Jeffersonian Republicans favoring France. The treaty was for 10 years' duration. Efforts to agree on a replacement treaty failed in 1806 when Jefferson rejected the Monroe-Pinckney Treaty as tensions escalated toward the War of 1812. The treaty was signed on November 19, 1794. The Senate advised and consented on June 24, 1795. It was ratified by the President and the British government. It took effect the day ratifications were officially exchanged, February 29, 1796. This section talks about issues. From the British perspective, its war with France necessitated improving relations with the United States to prevent the U.S. from falling into the French orbit. From the American viewpoint, the most pressing foreign policy issue were normalizing the trade relations with Britain, the United States' leading trading partner, and resolving issues left over from the Treaty of Paris, which had ended with compromises on every issue but the essential one of independence. As an observer explained, the British government was well disposed to America. They had made their arrangements upon a plan that comprehends the neutrality of the United States and are anxious that it should be preserved. Nevertheless, the Royal Navy had captured hundreds of neutral American merchant ships in recent months as part of its blockade of revolutionary France, and British officials in Canada were supporting Indian tribes in their resistance to American settlers in the Ohio River Valley, territory which Britain had explicitly ceded to the United States in the Treaty of Paris. Congress voted for a trade embargo against Britain in the spring of 1794, which affected the commerce of the northeastern states in particular. The still infant government under the Constitution was divided between the party of Jefferson and Madison, which favored the French, and the Federalists led by Hamilton, who saw Britain as a natural ally, and thus sought to normalize relations with Britain, especially in the area of trade. Hamilton devised a framework for negotiations, and President George Washington sent Chief Justice of the Supreme Court John Jay to London to negotiate a comprehensive treaty. The American government had several outstanding issues, and they're bullet pointed here. 1. The British were occupying forts on U.S. territory in the Great Lakes region, at Detroit, Mackinac, in modern-day Michigan, Niagara, and Oswego in New York. Also Miamis in modern-day Ohio. Next bullet point. The British were continuing to impress American sailors into British service. Next. American merchants wanted compensation for 250 merchant ships, which the British had confiscated in 1793 and 1794. Next. Southern politicians wanted monetary compensation for slaves who were evacuated by the British Army following the Revolutionary War. Next. Merchants in both America and in the Caribbean wanted the British West Indies to be reopened to American trade. Next point. The boundary with Canada was vague in many places and needed to be more clearly delineated. The next point. The British were believed to be aggravating American Indian attacks on settlers in the Northwest, modern-day Kentucky and Ohio. That ends that section. Okay, the treaty terms. Both sides achieved many objectives. The British agreed to vacate the western forts by June 1796, which was done, and to compensate American shipowners. The British paid $10 million by 1802. In return, the United States gave most favored nation trading status to Britain and acquiesced in British anti-French maritime policies. The United States guaranteed the payment of private pre-war debts owed by Americans to British merchants that could not be collected in U.S. courts. The U.S. paid £600,000 in 1802. The two joint boundary commissions were set up to establish the boundary line in the northeast, if agreed on, the St. Croix River, and in the northwest. This one never met, and the boundary was settled after the War of 1812. Jay, a strong opponent of slavery, dropped the issue of compensation for slaves, which angered Southern slaveholders. Jay was unsuccessful in negotiating an end to the impressment of American sailors into the Royal Navy, which later became a key issue leading to the War of 1812. And this is still under treaty terms. Subheading, American Indian Rights. Article 3 states, "It is agreed that it shall at all times be free to His Majesty's subjects and to the citizens of the United States, and also to the Indians dwelling on either side of the said boundary line, freely to pass and repass by land or inland navigation into the respective territories and countries of the two parties on the continent of America, the country within the limits of the Hudson's Bay Company, only excepted, and freely carry on trade and commerce with each other." Article 3 of the Jay Treaty declared the rights of Indians, Native Americans, as well as of American citizens and Canadian subjects to trade and travel between the United States and Canada, which was then a territory of Great Britain. Over the years since, the United States has codified this obligation in the provisions of Section 289 of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, as amended in 1965. As a result of the Jay Treaty, Native Indians born in Canada are therefore entitled to enter the United States for the purpose of employment, study, retirement, investing, and/or immigration. Article 3 of the Jay Treaty is the basis of most Indian claims. Approval and dissent. Washington submitted the treaty to the United States Senate for its consent in June 1795. A two-thirds vote was needed. The treaty was unpopular at first and gave the Jeffersonians a platform to rally new supporters. As the historian Paul Varg explains, the treaty was a reasonable give-and-take compromise of the issues between the two countries. What rendered it so assailable was not the compromise spelled out between the two nations, but the fact that it was not a compromise between the two political parties at home. Embodying the views of the Federalists, the treaty repudiated the foreign policy of the opposing party. The Jeffersonians were opposed to Britain, preferring support for France in the wars raging in Europe, and they argued that the treaty with France from 1778 was still in effect. They considered Britain as the center of aristocracy and the chief threat to the United States' republican values. They denounced Hamilton and Jay, and even Washington, as monarchists who betrayed American values. They organized public protests against Jay and his treaty. One of their rallying cries said, "Damn John Jay. Damn everyone that won't damn John Jay. Damn everyone that won't put lights in his window and sit up all night damning John Jay." Thomas Jefferson and James Madison strongly opposed the treaty as they favored France. Foreign policy became a major dispute between the Federalist and Democratic Republican parties. It became a core issue of the first-party system. Jefferson and his supporters had a counter-proposal to establish a direct system of commercial hostility with Britain, and even at the risk of war. The Jeffersonians raised public opinion to fever pitch by accusing the British of promoting Indian atrocities on the frontier. The fierce debates over the treaty in 1794-1795, according to one historian, this is kind of a quote, transformed the Republican movement into a Republican Party. End quote. To fight the treaty, the Jeffersonians established coordination in activity between leaders at the Capitol and leaders, actives, and popular followings in the states, counties, and towns. Jay's failure to obtain compensation for lost slaves galvanized the South into opposition. The Federalists fought back, and Congress rejected the Jefferson-Madison counter-proposal. Washington threw his great prestige behind the treaty, and the Federalists rallied public opinion more effectively than did their opponents. Hamilton convinced President Washington it was the best treaty that could be expected. Washington, who insisted the U.S. must remain neutral in the European wars, signed it, and his prestige carried the day in Congress. The Federalists made a strong systematic appeal to public opinion, which rallied their own supporters and shifted the debate. Washington and Hamilton outmaneuvered Madison, who was opposition leader. By then, out of the government, Hamilton was the dominant figure who helped secure the treaty's approval by the needed two-thirds vote in the Senate. The Senate passed a resolution in June advising the President to amend the treaty by suspending the 12th Article, which concerned trade between the U.S. and the West Indies. In mid-August, the Senate ratified the treaty 20-10, with the condition that the treaty contained specific language regarding the June 24th resolution. President Washington signed it in late August. The treaty was proclaimed in effect on February 29, 1796, and in a series of close votes, after another bitter fight, the House funded the treaty in April 1796. James Madison, then a member of the House of Representatives, argued that the treaty could not, under constitutional law, take effect without approval of the House, since it regulated commerce and exercised legislative powers granted to Congress. The debate which followed was an early example of originalism, in which Madison, the father of the Constitution, lost. After defeat on the treaty in Congress, the Jeffersonian Republicans lost the 1796 presidential election on the issue. When Jefferson became president in 1801, he did not repudiate the treaty. He kept the Federalist minister Rufus King in London to negotiate a successful resolution to outstanding issues regarding cash payments and boundaries. The Amity broke down when the treaty expired in 1805. Jefferson rejected a renewal of the Jay Treaty in the Monroe-Pinckney Treaty of 1806, as negotiated by his diplomats and agreed to by London. Relations turned increasingly hostile as a prelude to the War of 1812. In 1815, the Treaty of Ghent superseded the Jay Treaty. Excuse me. Okay, this is the last section, entitled Evaluations.